For a few years, I worked in this factory that made, among other things, alarm clocks. It was an old building, with shadows that seemed to cling to the walls like cobwebs, and there was always this faint mechanical ticking in the background, like a heartbeat of the place itself. My job was simple: quality control for the alarm clock mechanisms. Each clock had to ring precisely at the set time. But there was one clock, an old model we were phasing out, that nobody wanted to handle. It was known simply as the Midnight Caller. Legend had it that this clock was returned multiple times, each owner complaining about it ringing at odd hours, especially at midnight. It would ring at that time regardless of how it was set. Eventually curiosity got the better of me one late shift. The factory was eerily quiet, with most workers gone for the day. I decided to take the Midnight Caller to my station for testing. I set it for 7 a.m. just to prove the rumors wrong. The clock's face was oddly pristine, its hands moving with a smoothness that belied its supposed malfunctions. That night, at exactly midnight, the alarm went off. The sound wasn't the usual shrill beep or ring, but more of a whisper, growing into a voice that seemed to echo from somewhere far yet intimately close. I jolted up, my heart racing, and silenced it. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper. I laughed it off as a prank by my coworkers, or perhaps a glitch. I reset it, this time watching the clock closely. As the hands reached 12 again, the alarm triggered, but this time, the whispering voice was clearer. It was calling my name, over and over, with an urgency that chilled my bones. Determined to find a rational explanation, I opened up the clock. Inside, where there should have been gears and springs, there was something organic. It looked like a small pulsating heart, veined with tiny wires. Horrified, I dropped the clock. It didn't break, but the heart-like mechanism stopped beating, and the whispering ceased. The next day, I tried to tell my supervisor, but he looked at me with tired eyes and said, "Some things are better left alone. That clock, it's not just a clock. It's a remnant from when this factory made more than mechanical devices." He explained that, decades ago, the factory was rumored to experiment with blending technology with the supernatural. It had apparently been trying to capture time itself, or something more sinister. The Midnight Caller was one of the last of those experiments, designed not to wake you for the day, but to alert you to the presence of something otherworldly at the witching hour. I quit that job soon after, but I took the clock with me, unable to leave it behind. Every night I set it, and every night at midnight it calls. Not just for me, but seemingly for whatever lingers in the boundary between our world and another. I've learned to live with it, or perhaps it with me. The clock doesn't just measure time anymore, it's a sentinel, a guardian at the gate of dawn, warning me of the thin veil that separates night from nightmare. As I'm sure a lot of CS students have done, at one point I had to make an alarm clock program. It wasn't anything fancy, I just had to accept text-based commands and do things like output the time in both 12 and 24-hour format. I thought it would be a straightforward project, something to showcase basic programming skills from my portfolio. Little did I know, this simple project would turn into something far more unsettling. I named my program TikTok, a playful nod to its functionality. Initially, TikTok worked perfectly. It would wake me up with a gentle chime, and I could ask it for the time, set alarms, and even have it remind me of my schedule. But after a few weeks, things started to change. The first oddity was the time display. One morning, I asked for the time, and instead of the usual format, TikTok displayed, "Time is but a fleeting shadow." I laughed it off, thinking I must have accidentally coded in some Easter egg during a late-night coding session. I checked the code, but found nothing unusual. The next incident was more disturbing. I set an alarm for 7 a.m., but instead, I was jolted awake at 3 a.m. by a cacophony that sounded like a mix between a scream and static. The screen was flashing red, with the words, "Wake now or forever rest." Heart pounding, I managed to shut it down. I assumed it was a bug, perhaps a glitch from a recent update I made to its sound library. Determined to fix these issues, I dove back into the code, combing through every line. Nothing. No hidden messages, no erroneous time settings. It was as if TikTok had developed these quirks on its own. Then came the night that changed everything. I was working late, trying to debug another part of TikTok, when suddenly, all the lights in my room flickered. TikTok's screen turned on by itself, glowing an eerie green. It displayed, "Do you know what time it really is?" followed by coordinates. Curiosity mixed with fear, I plugged the coordinates into a map. They pointed to an old abandoned clock tower in the outskirts of town, known locally for stories of being haunted. Against better judgment, I decided to visit the location. The tower was decrepit, covered in ivy, with an ominous silence surrounding it. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and there on the wall was an ancient clock, its hand stuck at 3:15. That was the same time TikTok had woken me with its scream. As I approached, the clock's hand suddenly moved, ticking loudly in the silence. Behind me, a voice, mechanical yet eerily human, spoke from my phone. Time catches all, eventually. It was TikTok's voice, but I hadn't brought my laptop or any device capable of running it here. I started to panic and ran out, but not before noticing an inscription on the clock. Here lies the heart of time, bound by gears and fear. Back home, I destroyed the TikTok program, deleting every file ever associated with it. But even now, years later, sometimes in the dead of night, my devices glitch. They show the time as 3:15, and I hear, ever so faintly, the tick-tock of a clock that doesn't exist in my room. The project was supposed to be simple, but it opened a door to something inexplicable, something bound to the very essence of time, watching, waiting, perhaps for the right moment to wake us all. A few years ago, I had to travel for business, and randomly the alarm clock in my hotel room didn't work. It was an old-fashioned model, with large luminous numbers and a mechanical ticking that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I remember setting it the night before, ensuring the little red hand was firmly on the alarm position. Yet, when morning came, I awoke to the soft natural light filtering through the curtains, rather than the shrill ring I had anticipated. Curiosity piqued, I examined the clock. Its face was cold, the ticking now silent, as if time itself had paused within its gears. But as I touched the dial, a strange sensation coursed through me, a warmth, almost like a caress, that seemed to originate from the clock itself. The room around me began to blur, the edges of reality softening like a dream. Suddenly, I was no longer in the hotel room, but instead standing in what looked like a Victorian parlor. The clock was still in my hand, now ticking loudly, its hands spinning wildly. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and old books, and a woman, dressed in a flowing gown that seemed to shimmer with every movement, stood by a fireplace. She turned, her eyes meeting mine with a mix of surprise and recognition. "You've come through time," she whispered, her voice a melody that seemed to resonate with the ticking of the clock. "This clock, it's not just an alarm, it's a bridge." Her explanation was brief but clear. The clock was a relic, crafted by a clockmaker obsessed with capturing moments in time. Each alarm set was a potential jump, a chance to experience another era, another life. But there was a catch. The clock chose when and where, driven by some unseen force, or perhaps the desires of the traveler themselves. As she spoke, her fingers brushed against mine, adjusting the clock. The touch was electric, sending shivers down my spine, a mix of fear and an inexplicable attraction to this temporal anomaly. She set the alarm again, her eyes locked with mine, a silent promise, or perhaps a warning. The world spun again, and I found myself back in the hotel room, the clock now silent, its hands at rest. But something had changed. The room felt different, the air heavier with the scent of her perfume. On the nightstand, next to the clock, lay a small antique key, one that hadn't been there before. Each night after, I tried setting the alarm, but it never rang. Yet, every so often, I'd wake to find myself in another time, another place, always with her. This woman from the Victorian era, who seemed to be waiting for me across centuries. Each encounter was charged with an unspoken tension, a dance of time and desire, where every touch, every glance, was a reminder of the thin veil between moments. The clock, my silent companion, became both a curse and a treasure. It promised adventure, but at the cost of never knowing when or where I'd land next, or if I'd ever see her again. And in those fleeting moments, as time twisted around us, I realized that perhaps love, like time, was just another dimension we were meant to explore. And one we were meant to explore endlessly and passionately, without ever truly understanding its depth. 3 months before I graduated college, I didn't have a job lined up and honestly had no idea what to do. My days were a blur of anxiety and aimless wandering, until one evening I stumbled upon a quaint antique shop tucked away in an alley I'd never noticed before. The shop was dimly lit, filled with a musty scent of old wood and forgotten times. Among the relics, an alarm clock caught my eye. It was ornate, with a face that seemed to shimmer with a life of its own, the hands moving with an almost hypnotic grace. The shopkeeper, an old man with eyes that seemed to see through time, noticed my interest. "That clock," he said in a voice that was both a whisper and a warning, "has a history. It belonged to a woman who was said to have the power to weave dreams into reality, but be careful, young man, for it also weaves nightmares." Intrigued and desperate for any change in my monotonous life, I bought it. That night, I placed the clock on my nightstand. Its ticking was soft, almost like a heartbeat, soothing yet strangely exhilarating. I set the alarm for 7 a.m., my usual wake-up time, and drifted into a sleep deeper than any I'd known. I woke to the alarm, but not to its sound. Instead, a gentle whispering voice, unmistakably feminine, filled the room. "Wake up," it murmured, the words brushing against my skin like a lover's breath. The room was dark, the only light coming from the clock's face, which now glowed with an eerie luminescence. The voice continued, growing more seductive, promising secrets and desires fulfilled. Each morning, the voice would wake me, its tone becoming more intimate, more enticing. I found myself looking forward to it, my days filled with a strange, dark anticipation. The clock seemed to know my deepest fears and desires, playing them out in whispers that both thrilled and terrified me. One night, unable to resist, I asked the clock, "Who are you?" The voice chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "I am the keeper of your dreams and fears," it replied, "and tonight I will show you what you truly desire." The next morning, the alarm didn't sound. Instead, the room filled with a presence, tangible and overwhelming. The clock's face now showed not time, but a scene of my deepest, most forbidden desire, played out in vivid detail. The voice whispered, "This could be real, if you let me in completely." Torn between terror and temptation, I reached out to touch the clock. As my fingers brushed the glass, the scene on the clock's face shifted. It was me, but older, and successful and happy, everything I wanted. But then the image twisted. My reflection aged rapidly, decaying, until it was a skull grinning back at me. The voice laughed, a sound now cruel and mocking. Every dream has its price. Panicked, I hurled the clock against the wall. It shattered, and with it, the voice ceased. But as I stood there, breathing heavily, I realized something had changed. The room felt lighter, but I felt a void, a longing for that forbidden whisper. Days passed, and life returned to normal, but I was different. I had seen what lay beyond the veil of reality, and though the clock was gone, its last image haunted me. It was then I realized the twist. The clock didn't just show me my desires, it showed me my future. And now, without it, I was left to wonder if I had shattered my only chance at true happiness, or if I had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. I never had much luck with women at any point throughout my life. Perhaps it was my introverted nature, or the fact that my job as a software developer kept me glued to my screen rather than faces. That's why, when I met Clara at an antique shop, of all places, it felt like a glitch in the Matrix. She was as fascinated by the vintage alarm clocks as I was, her fingers tracing the curves of the brass bells with a delicate touch that made me wish, just for a moment, she'd look at me with the same interest. We bonded over our peculiar hobby, and to my astonishment, she seemed genuinely interested in me. Our conversations about the mechanics of timepieces soon turned into late-night discussions about life, love, and the inevitable passage of time. Clara had this old alarm clock, a beautiful piece from the early 20th century, which she insisted had a life of its own. "It doesn't just wake you up," she whispered one evening, her voice low and enticing. "It wakes up your deepest desires." Intrigued, and admittedly smitten, I invited her to my place, where she brought the clock. That night, she set the alarm for midnight, a playful smile on her lips. "Let's see what dreams may come," she teased, her eyes glinting with a mix of mischief and mystery. As we lay in bed, the room lit only by the moonlight filtering through the curtains, the atmosphere was charged with an unusual energy. The ticking of the clock seemed to sync with my heartbeat, growing louder, more insistent. Clara's closeness was intoxicating, her breath warm against my neck, promising unspoken pleasures. Then, midnight struck. The alarm didn't just ring, it screamed, a cacophony that seemed to shake the very walls. But with it came visions, not of terror, but of intense, overwhelming desire. It was as if every suppressed longing I ever had was unleashed. Clara, in that chaos of sound and emotion, seemed to transform, her touch igniting my skin, her whispers in my ear, not just words, but electric currents. But as suddenly as it began, the ringing stopped. The silence that followed was thick and almost tangible. I turned to Clara, expecting to see the same fervor in her eyes, but what I found was emptiness. She was there, yet not. Her skin was cold and her gaze was fixed on the clock. "Clara?" My voice trembled. She didn't respond. Instead, she slowly turned her head towards me, her expression one of serene sadness. "It's not me you're in love with," she said, her voice echoing as if from a distance. "It's what the clock brings out in you, what it shows you." Confused and still reeling from the sensory overload, I watched as she stood up, her figure beginning to fade, becoming translucent. "The clock," she continued, "feeds on desire, on the life force driven by passion. I was once like you, lured by another, trapped by my own yearnings." Before I could react, she was gone, and with her the clock. The room felt emptier than ever, the silence now a void where once there was promise of love, or something like it. The next morning I searched for Clara, and for any sign of the clock, but I found nothing. The antique shop where we met had no record of her, no memory of the clock. Now, every night, I hear a faint ticking, though there's no clock in sight. It grows louder as midnight approaches, a reminder of the night that both awakened and imprisoned me. I realized then, the true horror wasn't the clock or what it did, but the realization that my deepest desires might forever be entwined with an echo of a woman who was never truly there. Someone who was bound to an artifact that feeds on human passion.